Okay, so this presentation is going to be about narrative writing. Okay, so as we know, narrative writing is writing a story of some sort. So, as you can see in the first slide, the title is narrative writing. But before I even look at the bullet points, I just want to say one thing. With a narrative, I cannot stress the importance enough of a plan. A plan is the most important thing when you are writing a narrative. Without a plan, your narrative will not be successful. It will not achieve what you want it to achieve. It will not have the desired effect. Okay? So just remember that a narrative, you must have a plan. The best way I can explain it is this. That imagine you were telling a joke. Would you start telling a joke if you did not know how the joke ended? No, you wouldn't. Okay? A joke will not work if you, for example, like knock knock, and then they say who's there, and then you're like, let me think about who was there. The joke will fall flat. It will not work. And a narrative is exactly the same thing. You have to know how it's going to end before you start it. Now, there are minor details you can alter along the way, but the course of the story must be known by the writer before they start. Okay? So if you don't know how it's going to finish, don't start. Plan it out first. I would dedicate 5-10 minutes even to making a plan first. It can just be bullet points. It can be a timeline. I like the timeline way because it dictates the chronological order of your essay. So my plan, the way I plan a narrative would be I draw a timeline and then I add in my bullet points along the timeline of what's going to happen and things like that. Okay? So that's the first thing I wanted to say is you will not have a successful narrative if it does not have a plan. Okay? So if you look at the first slide, you can see the things that I'm going to discuss in this presentation. So we have the hook, then we have the introductory background, then we have the setting, then we have characters, then we have the unfolding events or the action, and then we have the verdict. Okay? So these are all the things that I will be discussing in this presentation. But remember, all of these things must be in your plan. Okay? Your plan is the first thing you must do. Okay? There's nothing worse than a narrative and you're trying to figure it out as you go along, because that will not work. Okay? So just be aware. Make sure you have a good plan before you start writing your essay. Slide number 2 is about the hook. Now this is what must appear in the opening sentences of any narrative. Now if you think of a hook in fishing, a hook is what catches the fish. And it's the same thing in a narrative essay. The hook is what hooks the audience, catches the audience attention right at the beginning of the essay. Now, remember, this is a narrative, it's a story. And the point of a story is to be entertaining in some way. It has to be something that creates interest in the reader, or else they will not finish the story. How many times have you picked up a book and read the first 10 pages of it, and it didn't grab your attention the way you liked, and you put it down, you did not finish? It's the same with an essay that you're going to do. Okay? You have to have something at the beginning that's going to arouse the interest of the reader and make them want to read on. Okay? So as you can see by the first bullet point, I have be captivating. Right? Capture the audience attention. Do something interesting, something unusual. Start in an unusual way. Start with an unusual scenario. Something that's not the run-of-the-mill usual type of beginning to a narrative. Because straight away, the reader will go, oh, that's interesting. That I wasn't expecting that. I'll read on. Okay, so be captivating. Now, create a tone is the second bullet point. You have to write in a way that presents the story in the tone that you wish. Okay? So think of it, if this was being read out loud, will the tone create the atmosphere you are looking for in your story? And that is dictated by the language you use. Okay? It must create the intended emotion. If your narrative is supposed to create fear, it should create fear. If it's supposed to be funny, it should be funny. If it's supposed to create anxiety, if it's supposed to create interest, whatever the emotion that you are looking for, you must use language that will create that emotion in the reader. So you have to put yourself in the reader's shoes and think, if I read this, would it create the desired emotion? If the answer is no, then you have to change your language and write it in a different way. If something is supposed to be scary and it's supposed to be funny, then you have not been successful. Think of movies are probably the best example. Have you ever watched a horror movie, but it wasn't scary and you hated it and it was like, oh, that was a waste of time, I shouldn't have gone to the cinema to see that? That's the same thing in your narrative. It has to create the intended emotion, or else you have failed in what you are trying to achieve. So here we have an example of a hook, what you can use at the start of your narrative essay in order to grab the audience's attention. So let's have a look at the one I've chosen here as an example. Chapman Elementary was the same that morning as I walked up the even cement steps. Rust covered the brown heavy front doors as always. Wax shone throughout the front hall. Mrs. Dugan's first grade classroom looked unchanged, with equations written with white chalk on a green chalkboard. That day everything seemed the same, but me, I was different. So this hook creates a sense of mystery at the start of your essay. Now there are hundreds of ways you can do a hook. This is just a very simple example. So it raises the question, why was the character different? Something must have happened on this day, this regular day that started like any other day, but something changed. What changed? So it definitely creates a sense of mystery and intrigue for the audience. What happened? What happened to this character? So you have hooked the audience by creating a sense of mystery and wanting to find out why the character was different on this particular day. Slide number 3 is the introductory background. Now, if you are not familiar with this term, I'll just explain it now. The introductory background is the additional information you need to give to the reader so they can be in a position to fully appreciate the story you're trying to tell. It's the background information that's vital for the reader's understanding of what you're trying to say. Okay? So I have 3 keywords written down here. I have visualize, imagine, and recreate. The introductory background, this information that's maybe previous to the story or something like that, you have to introduce in order for the reader to be able to visualize what you're talking about, imagine the scenario you're talking about, and be able to recreate the image in their mind. Okay? So that's what the introductory background is. It's any information you feel is absolutely necessary for the reader to know so that they can appreciate what you're saying in the story. If they don't understand the story, if they can't imagine it, if they can't visualize it, if they can't recreate it in their minds, then it won't be successful because they won't be able to relate to what you are saying. Okay, so that's what introductory background is. Any information that's necessary for the reader to know to enhance their appreciation of the story. So here we have an introductory background example. Now remember, introductory background is when you feel that there is information that is vital for the audience or the reader to know in order to fully appreciate or comprehend the story. So it's information that the audience or the reader needs to know. Okay, so let's look at the example. For me in particular, the net has become my universal medium, the conduit for most of the information that flows through my eyes and ears and into my mind. The advantage of having immediate access to such an incredibly rich source of information has gradually become more and more apparent to me, and I never would have guessed that it would lead me to my current predicament. So we can see from this that the influence of the internet on the character is something that has been going on over time, and it's something that has led to whatever problem is going to arise now in the story. So we have to have this background information to know the influence of the internet on the character in question. So as you can see, I've underlined, the net has become my universal medium, the conduit for most of the information that flows through my eyes and ears and into my mind. So it shows the influence the internet has on this character, that the majority of information that this character, whoever it may be, is getting is coming from the internet. So it has a huge influence over him or her. Okay, and as you can see by the last line, I never would have guessed that it would lead me to my current predicament. So whatever's happening in this story, it has to do with the influence the internet has on this character, and this is a detail that is important for the reader to know in order to understand the story and be able to follow it clearly. This slide is about setting. Now, setting is very, very important because obviously it sets the scene of where the story is going to take place. Now, as we can see, the first bullet point, it says place. Obviously, the setting is the place where it's taking part. I recommend, because of the word count we are restricted to in this, like we're probably going to aim for in and around 400 to 500 words. The place should not change too much, as in I wouldn't have too many different settings within the story. Why? Because you don't have enough time really to develop different settings. So I would mainly stick to one major setting if it was up to me, because I don't think you have time to be describing 2 different settings or 3 different settings or 4 different settings. It's better if the setting is one major place, okay, one main place. Okay, now we all think of place when we think of setting. We all always think of where it happened, but there's another vital part of setting that is often neglected, and that is the when, which you can see by the time, the second bullet point. So when it took place is just as important to the setting as where it took place. Okay, now when you are describing the setting, I think the best way to describe things that are around is, I like to tell my students that you go from external to internal. What I mean by that is you describe what's outside around the character, okay, and then you bring that internally and describe how that setting creates emotion in the character. Okay, for a very simple example would be, okay, if you describe a setting, it's a forest, it's late at night, it's windy, it's stormy, there's lightning, there's rain, and then you tell how the character is fearful and things like that, then that will add to the setting. So go from external to internal. Describe what's around outside the character, and then describe the atmosphere and the feeling that is created in the character. Okay? And the next thing I would say is concentrate on small details when you are describing something. Okay? Do not make like a shopping list. Don't try and describe every single thing that is all around the character. And I'll tell you why. Because, number one, it will take too long, and none of your descriptions will actually be deep enough to be of value. What I think is the better option is to concentrate on a few small details and really, really describe those well to create the setting. For example, if I was talking about, like we'll use the same example again, the forest, I would concentrate on something like the rain, how the rain felt, how the rain was falling, how the rain hit the trees or something like that. Concentrate on small details. So like the rain would be one, maybe the branches of the trees might be another, and concentrate on a few of these things in great detail, and that will add to the atmosphere that you're looking for. Okay, do not just make a shopping list of trying to describe everything all around. It takes too long, and none of the description you will give will be deep enough to actually be of value, so it won't work on the reader. It's better to analyze a couple of different things that are in the setting, and then really, really describe those things well to create the atmosphere. Here we have an example of setting. So let's just look at the example first. The scent of pine from the tree hung over the living room. Heaps of shredded wrapping paper lay strewn across the oriental rug. The ornaments and lights on the tree sparkled cheerily, while outside the sky was a dull whitish grey. Through the window we could see the bare trees shivering and bending in the wind outside. Leaning against the wall behind the festive Christmas tree was a long, thin package wrapped in brown paper. It was the last present yet to be opened, and scrawled on the paper was my name. So, from setting, remember, it's not just the where. Now, have we dealt with the where? Yes, we have. It is taking place in the living room, as you can see from the opening sentence. Okay, so now we have an exact location of where this story is starting or where it's taking place. It's taking place in the living room. Now, has when also been dealt with? Yes, it has. As you can see, it says bare trees shivering and Christmas tree. So we know it's around Christmas. It's a Christmas time, and it's a very cold Christmas time, and we see that from the personification of the bare trees, that they were shivering because it was so cold. Also, we have a lot of imagery, so it sets the scene, it sets the setting perfectly. We can see we're in the living room. There's wrapping paper all over the ground, on the rug. There's ornaments everywhere. There's lights, and it places the character in this setting. So the character's here opening Christmas presents, and there's one present left, which is covered in brown paper, and the character's name is on it. So from this setting, we know where the character is, we know the mood the character is in, we know what time of year it is, and we're led into like something interesting. There's one package left. Why is this one not opened yet? And it's in brown paper, not normal wrapping paper, and the character's name is scrawled on it. So this setting has done everything we want at the start of a narrative to get it going. Okay, we know where we are. We're in the living room. We know what time of year it is. It's Christmas. We know the character is here. We know that we can set the scene. We can clearly imagine what it looks like with all the wrapping paper and everything, a typical Christmas scene. And then the setting, we can see the character looking at this last package. So everything is laid out in this setting to get our narrative off to a good start. The next thing I want to discuss is character, or the characters in the story. Okay? Now, in your narrative, any major characters need to be introduced early, okay? Because you don't have enough time to develop a major character later on in your narrative, in my opinion. So you can introduce secondary characters maybe a little later in the story, but with major characters, it's good to get them introduced as quickly as possible, especially when you're writing a story that's going to be so short. Remember, you're not writing a novel here. You're not writing a short story as in you would see, like we studied in term 1. It's not like you have 2, 3, 4,000 words to develop this story. You do not. Okay? So the major characters need to be introduced early. Secondary characters maybe a little later. Okay? With the characters as well, it's very important to describe not only what they look like physically, but their personality and behavior and mental attitude is also very important to describe. We get a load of information from how people act, not just what they say or what they look like. So just make sure you give a very rounded description of your character so that the reader can fully understand who you are talking about. Okay? So the next thing I want to say, you have generally in a story you will have a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist is the main character or characters on the journey you're talking about in the story, and the antagonist is generally what's going against them. Now, the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a person. One of my favorite books to read is actually The Old Man and the Sea, which is about a man trying to catch this big marlin, this big sailfish. So it's him against the elements, against himself, against this fish. So it's not another person that's the antagonist. It's another just something else that's in the position of the antagonist. So the antagonist is what the protagonist has to overcome, whether that is a person, a place, a thing, whatever it may be. Okay? Now, as I said, with the characters, description is key. You have to give a very rounded description in order for the reader to understand the character you're talking about. The last thing I will say about this is the last bullet point. As you can see, I would limit the number of characters you choose. And the reason I say this is because you are limited by the word count here and your time. You don't have a lot of time to write a narrative in your exam at the end of whenever your exam is, okay? If you have too many characters, you won't be able to describe them properly and in great enough detail, and then the characters become very two-dimensional, very bland, very boring, and the reader won't get involved in their story. The reader has to be able to relate to a character in some way in order to appreciate the story that the character is in. So, I would limit the characters. I would have no more than 2 major characters in a story, just as a piece of advice. If you want to go for more, that's okay, that's your choice, but I would recommend no more than 2 major characters. So here we have an example of a character description in a narrative essay. So let's look at the example first. Grandpa was the king of the sea. He always appeared relaxed and calm, ready to fish. He may have been old then, but he was always ready and up for the battle to pull in that 30-pounder. Grandpa could sit for hours patiently waiting for a bite. I always admired and gazed at those enormous, calloused, scratched hands that had done so much, and his head with not too many white hairs left on top of it. Going fishing with Grandpa is my abiding memory of the summer when everything changed. Now this example of a description is done through first-person narration. So we know that the person describing this character is actually in the story. Now, there are 3 questions, as you can see, that you must consider from this character description. If it has been successful, there should be a valuable answer to each of these questions. So, we need, from this paragraph, what do we learn about Grandpa? What do we learn about the narrator? And what do we learn about their relationship? So, if you look at the paragraph, I have underlined certain things. So it says Grandpa was the king of the sea. Now, this shows how highly thought of Grandpa was by his grandson. Grandpa was the king of the sea. He was the highest. He couldn't make him any higher in his mind. Okay? So Grandpa was the king of the sea. So we learn a lot about the narrator and the relationship. He greatly admires his grandfather. Okay, now the next thing you can see, it says he was always ready and up for the battle to pull in that 30-pounder. So we learn a lot about Grandpa here. We learned that he was determined, he was up for a fight, he was willing to work hard. So we learn a lot from that, and it gives an idea of what type of person Grandpa was. Now, the next thing I have underlined, you can see enormous, calloused, scratched hands. This further shows that the grandfather or grandpa was a working man. His hands were huge, they were calloused, which means they had blisters from working hard, and they were all scratched up, okay? So this would show that the grandfather has worked hard all his life. Now, in character description, as I told you before, you should concentrate on small details, and this has been done in this example. The narrator has concentrated on the hands of the grandfather, and we learn so much by this great detail given about the hands. They're enormous, they're calloused, and they're scratched. So this gives us a lot of information about the grandfather. Okay, so that's what you need to do in a character description. You need to pick out things that will give extra information about the characters through the words you use in your narrative. Just as we have seen here with King of the Sea, it shows how the narrator looks up to his grandfather. It shows, and we have other things that give details of how hardworking and determined the grandfather was. This slide is about the events or the action that takes place in the story. Now remember, it is a story. It has to follow a timeline. Things have to happen that lead to a climax and then a resolution, okay? As we can see by the very simple diagram I have in this slide. Now, a couple of points I would just like to get across to you. Build gradually, okay? And don't try and do too many events in a short space of time. It becomes very confusing for the reader if there's too many things happening in a short space, okay? So if you have like 6 or 7 major events within 300 or 400 words, it can become very hard to follow for the reader. So build gradually, a couple of maybe events leading up then to a final climax, or basically think of a movie. The climax is the big fight at the end between the good guy and the bad guy. Think of Avengers, okay? Think of like all the superhero movies. You have a good guy and a bad guy, and the climax is the fight near the end to see who wins, okay? And everything leading up to that then is just getting towards the climax. So a couple of events building towards the climax is what I would recommend. I wouldn't have too many events because it can get a bit messy and a bit too confusing for the reader. And then obviously you have a resolution. What happens after the climax? You also have the option sometimes of leaving it as a cliffhanger where it ends where we don't know actually what happens. And this can sometimes be interesting if it works for your story. This next slide is titled Verdict. Now, this is more for you as the writer to check yourself if you achieved what you wanted to achieve. So I have 2 very simple bullet points. What did the characters achieve or learn? And was it what you intended in your plan at the start? And the second one, what emotion dominates the ending? Does the story create the emotion and lead to the emotion you were trying to create with the story? Do you feel happy at the end? Will this relate to the reader? So this slide is just about you checking your work, okay? Did things happen the way you wanted them to happen? And was the emotion created in the story what you intended? So, and ask yourself those questions as a writer. And if the story did achieve what you wanted to achieve, and it did create the emotion you wanted it to create, then you know you have a good narrative. The title for this slide is to add some flair. So what do we mean by flair? Flair is something that you have that separates you from the pack. It makes your narrative stand out from the rest. Now, I only recommend these things if you're very confident in your basics of narrative writing. Okay, if you're confident that you have the basics down, then these are things that you can use in order to enhance your narrative writing and make it even more entertaining or appealing to the reader. So, the first thing I have down is dialogue. Dialogue is very important because we learn a lot about a character by what they say and how they say it. So, use of dialogue can be very useful in a narrative. Okay, it gives a great insight into the character. However, please be careful that you do not turn it into a he said, she said, and it just goes, if there's too much dialogue, it just turns into a script. And this can be a danger with dialogue. I would use dialogue very sparingly. I would use it now and again to give an insight into a character, but I wouldn't use it all the time. That would be my advice. Because if, as I said, if you have it all the time, it just turns into a he said, she said, it going over and back, and it's like a script that actors would read. Okay? The next bullet point I have is third person narration. Now, a lot of people write in first person narration. Sometimes I think third person is a bit more dynamic because you can give more of an overview of everything that is happening in the story. So I prefer third person narration. Now, that doesn't mean that first person cannot be excellent. It can. I'm just thinking it gives a more overall view to the reader if the story is in third person narration. The next bullet point is non-linear narrative. What I mean by that is that at some stage during the story, the timeline jumps. It might be in a flashback or something. Okay? Now remember, do not attempt this if you're not confident in the basics of narrative writing. But if you are confident, and then you could use this non-linear narrative. It keeps the reader on their toes, it keeps it interesting. So you could have somewhere in the middle of the story, the timeline jumps. It might jump forward 10 years. It might jump back 5 years. Something like that, just to keep it interesting for the reader. You could also use dual narrative. Now this is quite difficult, so be very careful with it. Dual narrative means you tell the story, but it comes from two different point of views. So this would be, you're telling it from one character's point of view, and then you tell it from another character's point of view. This can be interesting for the reader also. The next bullet point, as you can see, is a shock ending. Something that is plausible but not expected. Okay, that's the key to a shock ending. If it's a shock ending that doesn't make sense, the reader won't appreciate it. Now, if it's a shock ending that's just unexpected, but the reader could see, oh, I never thought of that, but that makes sense, then it's an exciting thing for the reader, and it leaves them feeling like upbeat about the story. Oh my god, that was so good. Yet again, think of a movie that has a twist at the end that was believable but not expected. Okay? And the last bullet point I have in this slide for adding some flair is you could have a theme running through the story. Some overall message you're trying to create. Okay? Think of theme in the poetry. A poem usually has a theme that the poet is trying to get across. You can do that as an author of your narrative also, and if this theme runs through the narrative, it can be very, very interesting for the reader. So here we have a quick example of dialogue from a narrative essay. So let's just look at the example first. "Put that away," I shouted. "It goes in the closet over there, the one with all of the board games in it. You might have to move the baseball gloves. Actually, put it on the shelf with the basketballs and footballs, right next to my GameCube. Man, there is nothing to do here," Will whined. "Why don't we look in the garage?" Taylor said with a mischievous look in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe we can find something to do there," I smirked. We headed for the garage. Now, there is one recommendation I would make for narrative and the use of dialogue in a narrative. I wouldn't overuse it. I wouldn't turn it into a script where it's just this character said this, then this character shouted this, everything, and all through. It just becomes... I don't think it works as well. I think dialogue works better when you use it from time to time to give information about the character. And the second thing I would say is pick specific verbs that give exact meanings, right? So as you can see from the example, I have underlined shouted, whined, and smirked. All of these verbs have very specific meanings that can be clearly understood by the audience. I have not just said the word said, okay? Or asked or something like that. I have said how it's done. So the first part is shouted. The next one is whined, and the last one is smirked. These are very specific verbs that tell you exactly the intent behind the dialogue, what is meant by this dialogue. So they are just the two things I would recommend when you're using dialogue in a narrative essay. Finally, I have some tips that I think will help with writing any narrative. The first bullet point, as you can see, is show, don't tell. You must show the reader what is happening and not just tell the reader what is happening. If you just tell the reader, they won't get an understanding of what the story is about. Okay? I'll give you an example. You don't say that the character was nervous. You describe the character being nervous. You describe the beads of sweat running down his forehead. You describe him fidgeting. You describe his sweaty palms. This is showing the reader something and not telling them, and this is much, much better. The second bullet point I've written is be specific. Be concrete in your language. This will give the reader a much better understanding of what you're talking about. Okay? For example, imagine you asked your friend, how was the food at the restaurant last night? And they said, oh, it was good. Okay? Now, imagine the food at the restaurant was very, very spicy, and your friend likes spicy food. Of course he's going to say it's good. Okay? But imagine someone who doesn't like spicy food. They will think it wasn't good. Okay? So the word good is not specific. Words like good, bad, nice, these type of words, they're not specific. They actually give no information about whatever we are talking about. Okay? So be specific in your language. Okay? The next thing is tense consistency. This is a major problem for a lot of the students. Okay? Your tense must be consistent. If it is not consistent, if the tense keeps changing by mistake, it can be very, very confusing for the reader, and it ruins the fluency and flow of the story, and it makes it very hard to follow. The next thing is punctuation. Make sure your punctuation is on point, okay? Because if it is not, sentences just run into each other, and it doesn't flow the way that you intend if your punctuation is incorrect. And finally, paragraphing. Now, paragraphing in narrative writing is slightly different because you can have a massive variety of paragraph length. Okay? You could have a paragraph that's 1 or 2 lines. You could have a paragraph that's 10 or 15 lines. Okay? So make sure that the paragraph changes at appropriate times. If there's a change of setting, change paragraph. If there's a change of time, change paragraph. If it's a change of point of view, change paragraph. If it's moving on to a different event, change paragraph. Pick the appropriate moments to change paragraphs within your narrative essay. This slide now is about examples of how you show and you don't tell. Okay, so you hear that a lot in narrative writing. You have to show, don't tell. So I've just put an example here. So the first one, it says the house was dilapidated. Now this is telling the reader that the house was dilapidated. It's not showing in what way was it dilapidated. So the audience or the reader does not get a clear image in their mind of the house because I've just told them it was dilapidated. But if you look underneath, I've done an example of showing the reader what is going on with the house. The crumbling walls were nothing more than a ghostly silhouette of some previous existence. The wind whistled through the trees and into the hallway through the rotting door, and the overgrown bushes and the shattered windows were evidence of the lack of care given to the mansion. So now, crumbling walls, that's a clear image I'm giving to the reader. Ghostly silhouette, like a shadow, like it also creates a mood and a tone. It's kind of a creepy kind of atmosphere. The wind whistled, so now I'm getting a sound that is going on in the house. Rotting door, I get a clear image of a door that's broken and all falling apart. Overgrown bushes and shattered windows. So the windows, I'm saying that the windows are broken and all the bushes all around the house are overgrown. And also I've used the word mansion instead of house at the end, which tells me that it's quite a large house. So all of these details are showing how the house was dilapidated, not just telling that the house was dilapidated. And this helps to create a very clear image in the reader's mind of the scene that is going on in your narrative. So remember, show, don't tell. Now, after this, I have 4 more examples of telling the audience. So you have to try and avoid this. Okay, try to avoid telling. So if you like, at home, you can take these 4 examples and try and transform them into showing sentences. So she was dressed weirdly. You can take that and you can change it and describe the clothing that this woman or girl is wearing, and describe how this would be weird. Like maybe they're wearing a crazy hat or wearing a weird dress or strange shoes. Okay, so you have to describe and show how the character was dressed weirdly. Don't just tell. the reader that the character was dressed weirdly. Okay, so these are examples you can transform and try and change them into showing descriptions, not just telling. Okay.